We're down to our last magazine, pinned in a ravine where every echo carried the enemy's laughter. The SEALs weren't quitters, but this time they knew. No reinforcements, no air cover, no way out. Then it came. A low, bone-shaking roar rolled over the ridge, growing into a scream that rattled teeth and made the ground tremble. Out of the blazing horizon, and a 10 Thunderbolt plunged like a predator, its GA-8 cannon unleashing a storm of fire. The sky turned into salvation. From that moment she banked hard, unleashing the full fury of her guns to sweep the ridge clean. You're watching Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The first thing that dies in a kill box is noise. Men stop shouting, radios go quiet, even the wind holds its breath. In the stone cut called Raven's Hollow, Echo 7 had learned that the hard way. They were spread along a jagged shelf just below a cliff lip, boots pressed into gravel, hands gripping rock as if the earth itself could hide them. Sun hammered the ridgelines. Heat turned the air into a mirage. Somewhere high to the east, a buzzard traced lazy circles, indifferent to what unfolded below. They had stopped expecting help long before they stopped calling for it. One of them still cupped a battered handset against his cheek, more ritual than hope. Between the boulders, black stains spread across hastily wrapped bandages. A scope, its legs broken and taped to a snapped trekking pole, peered across a moonscape of rock and scrub. Nothing moved. That was the point. Nothing would move until everything did. You can plot a valley on a map. You can brief slopes, sun angles, arcs of fire. You cannot brief intent. Whoever had drawn them into this pocket understood that. They had shepherded Echo 7 into a box with 3 walls of stone and 1 wall of air. The air was the trap. The air was where you killed the rescue, not the rescued. Command had seen it happen here before, learned the lesson and then forgotten it. At 86 kilometers away, Forward Post Orion ran on procedure. Canvas snapped on tent frames. Antennas turned in the sun. Inside the operations tent, the heat was heavier. Screens glowed green and amber. Over them leaned men and women with clipped hair and measured voices. A message that shouldn't have arrived did. Not a sentence, half a thought. It squeezed through the choke points in the mountains like a last breath. Echo 7, contact north and east, 2 down, request, then static. The comms officer didn't pretend it was a glitch. He stood with his hand over the toggle, weighing the decision. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Sector reads as Raven's Hollow. Maps came out fast. A colonel with deep sun lines bent over the contour lines. Around him, experts built their case for why nothing should be done. No altitude margin, no satellite lock, no space to turn, no relief bird. The math didn't allow for romance. The math said any aircraft that entered that notch became a slow-moving wish. It isn't superstition that gives places their names. It's habit plus funerals. Raven's Hollow had plenty of both. The eastern wall bore a long scar of glass where fire had once changed the stone. The west sloped like it was waiting to collapse. Between them lay a ribbon of air no wider than a city street. The last pilot to try it came back with a canopy full of shrapnel and a quiet prayer. "Say it again," the colonel said. "Raven's Hollow," the comms officer repeated. A liaison from Naval Special Warfare pushed into the tent, listened to the replay and frowned. "We didn't schedule them there," he said. "Not on the books." The room didn't ask what that meant. Not on the books always means the same thing. Orders from above, details omitted, blame left to drain away later. Out loud, they used other words: contingency, discretion, deconfliction. A captain asked the question no one wanted. If they're in that notch, what do we have that can get them? Silence. A-29s with clean wings, but wrong for the fight. Helicopters already tasked elsewhere. Someone mentioned fast movers and drew a dry laugh. You don't bring a rapier to dig a ditch. The colonel stayed still. Has anyone here flown Raven's Hollow? He asked. No one answered. Then a young operations officer, speaking before caution could stop him, said, "One. There's one." Heads turned. Major Selina Rourke, he said. She put an A-10 through that valley 2 years ago. Brought a team out that had no business making it. He didn't add that it worked. She's grounded, someone said. Temporarily, came the reply. Where is she? The colonel asked. On the edge of a field where aircraft waited to be needed again, Selina Rourke sat on a sun-warmed bench, watching an engine under repair. Her posture was ordinary. That was her way, ability without announcement. In Orion, the debate kept turning. Flight ops shook their heads over the profiles. The liaison described likely enemy positions, launcher teams in shadow, spotters with cheap optics and good patience, a mobile jammer tuned to the right frequencies. An intel chief pointed to thermal images that suddenly meant too much. The colonel listened to every word. It's suicide, someone said. And if we wait for nightfall? A logistics major asked. They won't see nightfall, the liaison answered. Out in the notch, a medic poured powder into a canteen cap. The man on the ground cursed once, grateful for the ordinary pain. A sniper swept his scope across the upper left quadrant and found the wrong kind of stillness. On the western shelf, a patch of thorn moved without wind. Fingers tightened on triggers. They had made themselves small, packs flattened, helmets dulled, watches hidden. The world had made itself big, the valley arched and held sound like a cathedral. Each of them carried a piece of home small enough to fit between heartbeat and breath. One voice said, "This is how stories end." Another answered, "Not like this." In the tent, the colonel set his hand on the map. "What do we have that can take a punch?" he asked. "A 10, someone said. The mood shifted slightly, then the warning came. No one scheduled, no one cleared for that corridor, and Rourke has no codes. Her status is red. "Status can be updated," the colonel replied. The judge advocate raised a hand. "Sir, with respect." "With respect taken," the colonel cut in. "What I need to know is whether we want to live with ourselves tomorrow morning." "Get me Rourke," he said. The young officer who had spoken her name had already pulled her file, the red stamp bright across the front. He had also sent a runner to the maintenance hangars. There are words you do not send over an open net. At Falcon's Rest, a crew chief walked past the bench without looking at her. He stopped, turned slightly, and said one word, "Raven." Then he kept walking. If anyone noticed her shoulders shift, they said nothing. In Orion, the liaison listed contingencies. The intel chief marked impact zones. The comms officer tuned and retuned the set. Every tool that wasn't a weapon was brought into line. What call sign would she even use, a captain asked. Names matter in the air. They're a promise and a dare. Someone said the new one out loud for the first time, Sky Reaper. It sounded like both prophecy and warning. Outside, heat shimmered above the concrete. Under a corrugated overhang, Valkyrie 2 waited. An engine panel was scuffed. The nose showed a patch of fresh paint. On the canopy rail, a new name was chalked in, waiting for paint. Back in the valley, Echo 7's leader counted breaths, rounds and movements. He scratched out a route in his head that would kill them now. He pictured a clearing to the south, flat enough to land a giant, bare enough to bury one. He touched the shoulder of the man next to him. "We're moving at the next lull," he mouthed. The other nodded. Between them lay a coin flipped earlier to keep hands steady. When the lull came, it wasn't a gift. A pebble skipped down the western wall. The sniper adjusted by hairs. The sun washed the rock pale. Somewhere behind the crest line, someone who had been still for hours moved at last. The leader raised his hand. Radios at Orion breathed in and out. The colonel told them to hold discipline. The lawyer closed his mouth. The air waited. Selina didn't hurry. That was what unnerved people most about her, how she could walk towards something everyone else was running from and never break pace. The bench she'd been sitting on still held the faint impression of her weight when she stepped off the concrete and into the long shadow of Hangar 4. The air smelled of hydraulic fluid and scorched dust. Tools lay scattered on a rolling cart, the kind of casual disarray that meant someone had been interrupted mid-task. Valkyrie, too, crouched half in shadow, its steel skin catching fractured blades of sunlight slicing through the ragged gaps in the sheet metal roof. Access panels hung open, veins of wiring exposed like a living thing mid-operation. A ladder clung to the port side, its top rung grazing the cockpit's rim. One crewman glanced up, met her approach, and froze, caught between a salute and retreat. She didn't ask. She didn't explain. Her fingertips brushed the chilled curve beneath the nose as she passed. Fuel? The word was flat, not a question so much as a demand. 78, the reply stumbled out. Hydraulics still low, left stabilizers, it'll hold. She was already climbing. The seat took her like an old habit, one she'd never really quit. Her hands fell into the rhythm, switches, toggles, breakers, like muscle memory guiding them faster than thought. The diagnostics crawled reluctantly across the console. Half the bird's heart was shut down for inspection. She cut the locks one by one, coaxing dormant systems awake. A red warning blinked at the edge of her vision. She didn't so much as glance at it. In the control tower, a young controller with a headset noticed a change on his screen. "Valkyrie 2, confirm identity," he said into the mic. No reply. "Valkyrie 2, you're not on the launch schedule. Identify immediately." On the apron below, the Warthog's turbines began to spool, drawing in air with a rising metallic growl. The crew chief at the far end of the hangar caught the shift in tone and turned, eyes narrowing. He saw Selina's helmet rise above the canopy edge as she locked it into place. "Valkyrie 2, this is Tower. Hold position. You do not have clearance." The voice in her ear was calm, but the pitch climbed on the last syllable. Selina's only answer was to ease the throttles forward. The aircraft rolled out into the blinding sun, rubber whispering against the tarmac. At the tower window, the controller stood now, craning for a visual. "Who the hell is in that hog?" No one answered. The runway ahead shimmered in the heat. She pushed the throttles to military power, felt the airframe respond, the vibration tightening under her boots. The nose lifted, weight dropped away, and the ground became a ribbon sliding backward. As soon as she was airborne, she rolled left, dropping altitude until the valley floor swallowed her from the radar sweep. In the tower, the blip vanished from the scope. Out over the scrublands, Selina leveled at less than 200 feet. The horizon a jagged saw blade of ridges and broken stone. She eased the stick, feeling the stiffness in the controls. The upgrades promised. After her last mission had never come, Valkyrie 2 was still the same battered survivor, every quirk and imperfection etched into Selina's muscle memory. She adjusted trim manually, listening to the way the wind tore past the canopy, gauging the subtle resistance in the pedals. A range of foothills rose ahead, marking the first wall of terrain between her and Raven's Hollow. The air there was treacherous, eddies that could shove an aircraft sideways without warning. She threaded through the lower passes, keeping the sun over her right shoulder to blind any glass that might catch her silhouette. A thin veil of dust drifted from a bluff to her left. She banked slightly, eyeing the slope for movement. Nothing yet. At Forward Post Orion, the tent was no longer a place of argument. Those who had opposed the launch knew the decision was no longer theoretical. The colonel stood behind the comms officer, eyes fixed on the audio channel that carried the faint hiss of Selina's cockpit environment. "Keep that line open," he said quietly. No one needed to ask why. The first sign of the valley came as a shift in light. Raven's Hollow didn't open gradually, it yawned. Stone ramparts climbed on either side, their faces pitted and blackened where past fights had bitten into them. Selena dropped her altitude again, the proximity alarms chirping in protest. She silenced them with a flick. Below a certain height, the shoulder-fired weapons that haunted these slopes lost their easy lock. It was a trade-off, less exposure, less reaction time. A flicker on the left ridge, just a shadow darting from one notch to another. Her eyes caught it without needing the HUD. A squeeze on the stick, a nudge on the rudder, and she swung Valkyrie 2's nose toward the threat. The GAU-8's barrels began their spin-up, the vibration crawling into her bones. She didn't wait for a perfect lock. She fired in a controlled burst. The sound was less a gunshot than a tearing of the air itself. Rock splintered, dust geysered upward, and the shadow was gone. Her eyes were already searching for the next problem. A transmission crackled through the static. "Reaper? Sky Reaper, is that you?" The voice was strained, urgent. She keyed her mic. "Echo 7, I'm north and inbound. Keep your heads down." The reply was just relief wrapped in disbelief, we thought. "So did they," she interrupted, banking to follow the valley's bend. In the hollow's floor, Echo 7 had hunkered into what was left of an old livestock outpost, low walls of stone and sandbags, gaps stuffed with netting. A lookout perched on a shattered corner, scanning through a scope held together by tape. He saw the grey blur slicing between cliffs and yelled down, "She's here!" Heads turned upward. For a moment no one spoke. The A-10 didn't just pass overhead, it imposed itself, a presence heavy enough to feel in the chest. Selena didn't climb. She pressed lower, sweeping her path along the slope to force any hidden teams to flinch. The second contact came from the east face, a glint of metal behind boulders. She rolled hard, wingtips skimming so close to the wall that dry leaves fluttered in her wake. Another short burst from the cannon, another bloom of rock fragments. Figures scrambled, weapons abandoned. Her console lights began to stutter. A telltale tremor in the left throttle. She eased back slightly, coaxing the engine with careful pressure. Fuel was dropping faster than the pre-flight estimates. Low-level flying in this heat was a thirsty business. She glanced at the clock. Still time, but not enough to waste. The extraction point, Point Eagle, lay ahead on the valley's far side. A flat, open patch with no cover. She could picture it from memory, a place where a bird could land and enemies could see it from every angle. She keyed the forward frequency. Orion, visual on Echo 7. LZ is compromised. I'll need to clear it before the Chinooks come in. Static, then the operations controller's voice. Sky Reaper, you are not authorized for active engagement. You're under review. Return to base. Selena's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Review me later," she said, switching channels before he could answer. She climbed just enough to sweep the ridge beyond the LZ. Through the canopy glass she caught the telltale shapes. 4 fighters in staggered positions, a heavy weapon being hauled into place. No drone feeds had marked them, no one had looked hard enough. She leveled, aimed by instinct, and loosed another storm of rounds. The weapon team vanished in the spray of stone and lead. On the ground, Echo 7 began their push. 3 men carried a fourth between them, his leg a bloody absence. Another kept up a steady rhythm of fire to pin the eastern slope. Selena swung back over them, drawing any surviving shooter's attention upward. A missile launch would come soon. There was always one more lurking shot. She kept scanning, the valley walls sliding past in relentless grey. She could feel Valkyrie 2's age in the way the stick trembled against her grip, the subtle lag in response. But the machine was still with her, still willing to push. "Echo 7, you've got 3 minutes, she said into the mic. "I'll keep the sky clean." The team leader's answer came back without hesitation. "You already have." The LZ loomed closer, the emptiness of it as dangerous as any ambush. Selina widened her circuit, buying the Chinooksa corridor. The hollow echoed with the thump of her engines, a sound that told both friend and foe the air now belonged to her. Somewhere beyond the next bend, more hostiles would be moving into place. She intended to meet them first. The ridgeline on her right seemed to tilt inward, narrowing the strip of air until it felt like she was flying inside a closing fist. Selina held Valkyrie too steady, letting the roar of the twin turbines fill the canyon. Every vibration, every note in the engine's voice told her something. A change in pitch could be a warning, a deeper growl a sign she was squeezing more out of the power plant than the tech sheets ever intended. She kept one eye on the instruments and the other sweeping the broken slopes, searching for the next flicker of movement. Ahead, the bend in Raven's Hollow tightened like a noose. She banked into it, the weight pressing her into the seat as the valley wall swept past, just meters from her wingtips. The air here had a way of tricking the senses. Gusts could shove you toward rock or lift you suddenly into the line of fire. Selina compensated with small, precise corrections, each one calculated against the invisible forces at work. Her headset cracked to life. "Reaper, East Shelf, contact!" The voice was raw with urgency. She spotted them almost instantly, a cluster of armed figures darting between boulders above the approach to Point Eagle. They were moving fast, using the terrain's folds to stay hidden, but she'd flown this route before and knew the place's shadow couldn't hide. She rolled hard, aligning Valkyrie 2 for a shallow dive. The cannon spun up, the barrels a blur, and she cut loose in short bursts. The ground leapt in sprays of stone, figures scattered, some vanishing into dust. Before she could climb, another glint caught her eye, a launcher being hoisted into position farther up the slope. She shoved the stick forward, angling low enough to skim the surface of the valley floor. The sudden change in altitude disrupted the team's aim. The tube swung wide, struggling to track her. Selina climbed sharply at the last moment, tipping her wing toward them, and let the gun speak again. The weapon disappeared in a burst of debris. The valley momentarily fell still, but stillness here was never peace. It was reset. She banked toward the west side, scanning for the telltale rhythm of enemy movement. Far in the distance, a thread of smoke began to rise, too thin and controlled to be random. That was a signal, not an accident. Someone was calling reinforcements. Selina keyed the Chinook frequency. Eagle approach, adjust vector 20 degrees south, northern routes hot. The lead transport acknowledged with a clipped response, their rotors still miles out but closing. She knew their window was narrow. Any delay gave the other side more time to box the landing zone again. Valkyrie 2's warning panel flickered, a new amber light joining the others. She spared it a glance. One of the electrical subsystems was cycling erratically. It wasn't mission critical yet, but she added it to the growing list of things to manage. This sortie had become a balancing act between combat and survival, and neither could afford to take priority over the other. She dropped lower along the western slope, close enough to see the strata in the rock. A shadow moved in one of the crevices, a quick sliding motion that didn't match the wind. She tightened her turn, bringing the nose around until her sights lined up. A controlled trigger pull, and the Avenger's voice rolled through the canyon again. The shadow disappeared in the shock of pulverized stone. The radio flared with ground chatter, Echo 7 reporting they were within visual range of Point Eagle. Their tone carried the weight of exhaustion, but also momentum. They were moving, and if she could keep the path ahead clear for just a few more minutes, the rescue would hold. Her eyes flicked to the far rim. A new shape emerged, a squat silhouette braced behind a rock outcrop. Selina recognized the profile, a heavy gun, belt-fed, set to sweep the landing zone once the helicopters committed. She adjusted altitude, using the terrain to mask her approach until she was almost on top of them. Then she climbed just enough to clear the ridge and unleashed a precise burst. The emplacement buckled, the gunner thrown sideways. The ridgeline dropped away beneath her as she turned back toward the center of the valley. Heat distortion shimmered off the stone, blurring the outlines of anything more than 100 meters ahead. She adjusted her scan pattern, looking for breaks in the haze that might betray movement. Twice she caught faint shifts, once the glint of a scope lens, once the unnatural rhythm of a human figure moving against the wind. Each time, she altered her route to cut them off before they could set up a shot. The fuel gauge ticked downward, a reminder that this was not an endless dance. Selena calculated her burn rate against the distance back to friendly airspace and pushed the thought aside. For now, she had enough. That was all that mattered. In the distance, the heavy thrum of rotor blades began to echo off the walls. The first Chinook swept into view, its nose angled toward the patch of flat earth ahead. Selena moved to intercept the flight path, her eyes scanning for any last-minute threats. She found one almost immediately, a pair of figures breaking cover on the far slope, one carrying what looked like another launcher. She accelerated, diving to draw their attention, and fired a warning pass close enough to throw dust into their faces. They dropped back into the rocks, the weapon tumbling from their grip. She swung around again, keeping herself between the helicopters and the most dangerous terrain. The first transport flared for landing, kicking up a storm of grit. Echo 7 moved toward it in bursts, covering each other with short, disciplined fire. The second Chinook orbited higher, waiting for the all-clear. Selena knew they were exposed during that hold. Any lingering adversary would see them as the juicier target. Another movement, south ridge this time. She rolled into it, and that was when she saw the telltale white streak of a missile launch, the plume angled not toward her but toward the circling Chinook. Instinct made the decision for her. She shoved the throttles forward, crossing the missile's trajectory, forcing its seeker to lock onto her hotter engines. It bit, curving away from the helicopter and chasing her into the narrower cut of the canyon. The world funneled into a single straight line ahead, walls closing in on either side. She could feel the missile closing, the growl of its motor rising in pitch. Timing was everything now. She aimed for a sheer rock face that jutted across part of the channel, holding course until the last heartbeat before impact. Then she yanked the stick back, hauling Valkyrie 2 into a climb so steep her harness cut into her shoulders. The missile didn't make the turn. It slammed into the stone in a burst of fire and shrapnel. Selena leveled out above the blast, the Warthog's frame shuddering from the shockwave. She checked her systems, still battered but holding. Behind her, the Chinooks were moving, one lifted with its cargo of exhausted soldiers. The other began its descent into the now secured zone. She circled above, eyes never resting, every turn of her head checking a different quadrant of the battlefield. The sky over Raven's Hollow was far from safe, but for the first time since she'd dropped into this canyon, it belonged, if only briefly, to her. The first Chinook climbed away from Point Eagle, its belly heavy with men who only minutes before had been staring at the end of their story. The second bird dropped into position, rotors kicking up a thick haze that rolled across the clearing like a living thing. Through the swirling grit, Selena caught the shapes of Echo 7's remaining members sprinting toward the open ramp, their silhouettes bent low under the downdraft. She kept Valkyrie 2 in a slow, deliberate orbit, just inside the bowl of cliffs that framed the landing zone. Every pass let her sweep a different segment of the ridges, tracing the lines of rock for anything that didn't belong. The blast from the intercepted missile still hung in the air as a dark smear on the canyon wall. She marked it without dwelling. The fight wasn't finished. A flicker on the southern rim drew her attention, a shadow where there shouldn't be one, just above a pocket of scrub. The movement was cautious, methodical. Whoever was up there wasn't retreating, they were waiting. Selena nosed the aircraft toward it, but instead of firing immediately, she climbed for a better angle. From above, the brush opened into a narrow firing shelf, perfect for a long shot on the LZ. She armed the cannon, pressed in, and cut loose a short, sharp burst. Dust and fragments billowed outward, the figure tumbling out of view. But before she could swing away, her sensors picked up two more heat signatures slipping out from behind a rock formation further along the ridge. They were moving in opposite directions, clearly trained to divide her focus. She picked the one angling toward higher ground and closed in, forcing them into cover before they could line up a shot. Down below, the last of Echo 7 was climbing into the Chinook. The loadmaster stood at the ramp, gesturing hard for them to hurry, one hand braced against the fuselage. The landing zone was as vulnerable now as it had been when she first saw it, maybe more so because everyone knew their time here was running out. Selena brought Valkyrie 2 around in a wide arc, engines reverberating off the cliff faces. The second Chinook was powering up, the change in rotor pitch carrying clearly even over her own turbines. That was the signal the enemy needed if they were holding back. On her third sweep she saw it, 3 faint glimmers on the northern ridge, lined in a staggered pattern that would give overlapping fields of fire. One was already behind a mounted weapon, the others feeding ammunition and spotting. They weren't shooting yet, they were waiting for the helicopter to lift, to give them a clear rising target. There wasn't time for a careful approach. She dropped in low, cutting across the LZ at an angle that kept her between the gun team and the transport. The Avenger barked again, tearing through the rock lip that concealed them. One gunner crumpled instantly, the others scrambled back in a cloud of debris. The second Chinook began to lift, skids clearing the dirt. Selena shifted her pattern to cover the southern and western approaches now, scanning for any last-ditch threats. The air shimmered with rotor wash and heat, the visibility turning patchy. That was when she noticed the odd stillness along the far western wall. No scurrying fighters, no flashes of muzzle fire, just 3 fixed points that hadn't moved during the entire exchange. She adjusted her course, letting the Warthog sensors focus. The thermal readouts were faint but consistent, human-shaped but unusually cool. They weren't in firing positions, they were watching. The realization sat wrong. Every instinct told her these weren't stragglers or late-arriving combatants. They were observing. And they were positioned exactly where she'd been most exposed during her earlier passes. The second Chinook climbed higher, banking toward the exit corridor. Selena stayed low, shadowing its ascent until both helicopters were clear of the immediate threat zone. The extraction was complete, but her work here didn't feel finished. She swung Valkyrie 2 back toward the suspicious cluster on the western wall. Closing the distance, she could make out a single figure still standing while the others had melted into the terrain. No weapon visible, no attempt to hide. The posture was almost casual. Her thumb hovered over the weapons control, but something in the stillness made her hesitate. Whoever it was, they'd chosen to be seen. She marked the coordinates and keyed into the secure channel. Orion, flag west wall position, grid. Static drowned her for 2 seconds before the signal cleared. Repeat, marked coordinates for follow-up. Possible non-combatant observer. The colonel's voice came back, tight. Copy. Stay on station until relief arrives. Selena banked into a holding pattern, climbing above the highest ridge to keep a wide field of view. From here, Raven's Hollow looked less like a battlefield and more like a scar. Pale rock veined with black where explosions had scorched it. The valley floor was littered with churned earth, shattered stone, and the faint outlines of where men had taken cover minutes ago. Her fuel warning chimed, a persistent, nagging tone she'd been holding off as long as possible. She checked her remaining stores. Enough to get out, but not with much margin. She informed Orion of her status, but the order to maintain position held. They wanted her eyes here until a recon drone could take over. For several minutes nothing moved. The canyon seemed to have swallowed its own violence, settling into an uneasy quiet. Then, far to the south, a lone vehicle crept along a dry riverbed, lightweight, open-topped, and moving slow to keep its dust trail low. Selina couldn't tell if it was extraction for the observers or simply someone taking advantage of the chaos to slip through. She tagged it for the incoming drone and held her altitude. Finally, Orion confirmed the relief was en route. A shadow passed beneath her as a UAV slid into the valley, its sensors already sweeping. She handed over her marks, then turned Valkyrie 2 toward the exit corridor. The controls felt heavier now, every adjustment met with a slight lag. Hydraulics weren't happy, and neither was the left stabilizer, but the airframe was holding together. The climb out of Raven's Hollow was always deceptive. The walls fell away fast, giving the illusion of safety, but until she crossed the last ridge, the threat of ground fire lingered. Selina kept her profile low until the terrain began to slope away in all directions. Only then did she allow the nose to lift, the altimeter climbing steadily. Once she was back in open-air space, the radio chatter from Orion picked up, status reports on the SEALs, incoming medical teams, the colonel's clipped acknowledgements. She added her own report in precise, economical language, leaving out any speculation about the figure on the western wall. That conversation, she knew, would come later, and in a different room. The return flight to Falcon's Rest was a study in contrasts. The dull monotony of empty desert, broken by the occasional spark of movement, a shadow racing across the sand, a lone tower on the horizon, the glint of sunlight off a distant ridgeline. She kept her thoughts on the aircraft, listening for any new changes in pitch or vibration. As the base came into view, ground control cleared her straight in. No holding pattern, no waiting. They knew the state she was flying in. She eased Valkyrie 2 down, the landing gear meeting the tarmac with a solid, bone-deep thump. The nose dipped slightly before the struts caught, and then she was rolling, the taxiway stretching out ahead. She brought the aircraft to a stop near the far edge of the apron, away from the usual bustle. Engines wound down in a slow, shuddering fade, the air around her going strangely still after hours of constant motion. Selina unstrapped, pulled off her helmet, and climbed down before the ground crew had even reached the ladder. The first figures to step into her path weren't the grease-streaked mechanics or flight officers she'd expected. Instead, 2 men emerged from the hangar's shadow. Plain, regulation-cut uniforms with no rank, no name patches, nothing to identify them. The absence of insignia said more than any badge could. One of them lifted a hand, not quite a wave, not quite an order, and inclined his head toward a dark SUV idling in the shade. Its tinted windows reflected the fractured light filtering through the hangar roof. "Major Rourke," he said evenly, "you'll need to come with us." She let the silence stretch, her eyes moving from one expressionless face to the other. "Am I being charged with something?" "No, ma'am," the taller one answered, tone clipped. "Then this is, what, a debrief?" Her voice carried neither curiosity nor fear, just the sharp edge of someone weighing possibilities. "Command review," he replied, and the way he said it made the phrase sound heavier than any stack of reports. It wasn't the kind of weight you filed, it was the kind you carried. Selina's gaze flicked once over her shoulder, to where Valkyrie 2 sat with its scuffed paint and dust-streaked panels, the machine looking like it had been pulled from a forgotten corner of history. Something about the sight lodged in her chest. Then, without another word, she turned toward the SUV and walked as if each step was its own act of acceptance. The doors closed behind her with the soft, padded thud of a vault sealing. The cabin smelled faintly of hot vinyl and the sterile tang of air conditioning. Neither man spoke. Outside, the familiar geometry of the base perimeter slid past in staccato bursts. Chain-link fences, guard towers framed against the sky, the occasional blur of a passing patrol. Bit by bit, the landmarks gave way to open scrubland. Sunlight flashed across patches of gravel and thornbush, the road narrowing to a ribbon of cracked asphalt hemmed in by low concrete barriers. The SUV kept its steady, unhurried pace, carrying her farther from the noise of the flight line and deeper into a silence that felt deliberately cultivated. They didn't slow until a structure emerged ahead, a checkpoint so stark it looked carved into the earth itself. No welcoming signage, no flags, just the harsh lines of reinforced concrete and a narrow slit of an opening. It was less an entrance than a warning. The guards at the gate didn't bother with ID cards or clipped salutes. Instead, a handheld scanner swept slowly across the windshield, bathing the glass in a wash of green light. A brief pause, a faint electronic chirp, and the steel barrier rose without a word exchanged. Beyond lay a low, windowless building sunk partially into the earth, its exterior painted in mottled shades that blended seamlessly with the surrounding terrain. The SUV descended a short ramp into a covered bay, shadows folding around them as if they'd crossed an unseen threshold. One of the plainclothes escorts stepped out first, the other holding the rear door open for her. Selina climbed down, the air in here cooler, the echo of her boots clipped short by the close walls. Inside, the corridors were bare, lit by recessed panels that gave nothing away about time of day. They led her to a room that was neither an office nor an interrogation cell, but borrowed elements from both: metal table, 2 chairs, a pitcher of water in the center. A man was already seated on the far side, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair touched with grey. His stillness was the kind that came from long years of watching without being watched. "Major Rourke," he said by way of greeting, his tone flat but not hostile. Selina sat, pulling the chair in until her knees touched the edge of the table. "I assume you've already read the sortie report?" "I have," he replied, flipping open a slim folder. "You violated an active grounding order, took an aircraft that wasn't cleared for service, engaged without authorization, expended ordnance off roster." His eyes lifted from the page. "You also ensured the survival of every member of Echo 7, neutralized multiple armed positions, and intercepted 2 separate missile threats, one of which was targeting a high-value transport." She didn't respond. The man let the silence hang for a moment before setting the folder aside. "Do you know why you're here instead of in front of a formal tribunal?" "I imagine this is the part where you tell me," she said. He leaned back slightly. "We've been monitoring Ravens Hollow for months. It's not just a geographic hazard, it's a funnel, a controlled environment. Whoever operates there has been using it to test our responses, mapping how we react under pressure." Selina's jaw tightened. "And the figure on the western wall?" His expression didn't change, but she caught the faintest acknowledgement in his eyes. "Not the first time we've seen that posture. Same position, same apparent detachment during other incidents. Always when certain pilots are in play. You think they were there for me?" "I think they were there to see what you would do," he corrected. "And now they have more data." She pushed the picture aside, leaning in. "Then the problem isn't that I went in. It's that you sent others in before me without clearing the ground, knowing it's being used as a proving ground. That's above my pay grade," he said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "What matters is that you've now flown it twice and returned, each time with the upper hand. That won't last forever." "Which is why," he said, sliding a smaller folder across the table, "we're reassigning you." She opened it. Inside was a black fabric patch, stitched with a name in pale thread: Sky Reaper. No unit designation, no squadron insignia. Just the call sign. "This isn't about discipline anymore," he went on. "It's about putting you where you can be most useful without the limitations of standard command structure." You'll operate out of a different location. You'll be tasked directly by you, by those who decide which fights are worth having, he said. Selina closed the folder, fingers resting on the patch. And if I say no, you won't, he said without hesitation, because you already decided when you pushed the throttles forward this morning. The meeting ended without ceremony. The escorts led her back to the SUV, retracing the featureless corridors until daylight returned in a rectangle framed by concrete. The drive back didn't take her to Falcon's Rest, but to a smaller airstrip tucked behind a line of low hills. Here, the hangars were oversized, their doors sealed, the aprons empty except for a few service carts and a refueling truck. A crew chief met her at the edge of the tarmac, offering a crisp nod before gesturing toward one of the closed bays. When the doors rolled back, Valkyrie 2 stood inside, already cleaned, panel seams buffed free of the grit from Raven's Hollow. The fresh paint on her nose caught the light. Under the canopy rail, the same 2 words from the patch now marked in sharp lettering. Selina stepped closer, scanning for the smaller changes. Reinforced access panels, an upgraded sensor mount on the starboard wing, new countermeasure pods tucked into the fuselage lines. Someone had put time and resources into the airframe since she last shut down the engines. The crew chief's voice cut across the clatter of distant tools. Systems check is already complete, Major. She's fueled, fully rearmed, and cleared for departure whenever you say the word. Selina's brow arched slightly. My schedule? That's right. He hesitated for a beat before adding, You'll find the mission file waiting in your quarters. But if you want to take her up now... His words trailed off into the dry air, leaving the offer suspended between them like an open hangar door. Her eyes shifted past him toward the long, empty stretch of runway baking under the noon sun. Beyond it, the sky stretched in an unbroken sweep of deep, hard blue, the kind of clarity that made altitude feel limitless and every climb feel like a promise. She let the silence linger, then shook her head. Not yet, she said finally, her tone firm enough to close the matter. When I go up again, it won't be for a shakedown run. It'll be because there's something worth burning fuel for. The chief gave a single nod, as though the response had already been in his pocket, and turned away to pass instructions to the rest of the ground crew. Engines hummed faintly in the distance, the smell of jet fuel drifting on the light wind. Selina stayed where she was, beside Valkyrie 2, her fingertips brushing along the fresh coat of paint near the nose. The stenciled name caught the light, and for a moment it seemed to weigh more than the alloy beneath it. Every decision, every refusal, every mission she'd accepted and every one she'd walked away from felt pressed into those letters. When she finally stepped back, the airframe's shadow stretched long beside her, reaching toward the low building where her temporary quarters were waiting. Inside, the room was as spare as a barracks cell. One narrow bed, a steel locker, and a desk with a single manila folder laid neatly in the center. She opened it without sitting down. One photograph stared back at her, a grainy monochrome still, its blurred edges doing nothing to soften the intent it carried. The image was of a ridgeline she didn't recognize, jagged peaks cutting into the horizon. In the foreground, a solitary figure stood in the deep shade of rock, face hidden, stance deliberate. Beneath the picture, a strip of typed coordinates and altitudes sat like a challenge. The region was one she'd never flown, but even from the static image she could see the trap it posed. A narrow approach hemmed in by sheer walls, an arena of stone with only a handful of ways out. The kind of place where you either owned the sky or didn't leave it alive. Beneath the photo, only a date and time, no list of friendly units, no extraction plan. Whoever had put this together assumed she wouldn't need them, or they didn't plan on her having them. Selina sat on the edge of the bunk, the file open on her knees. She thought of the observers in Raven's Hollow, of the way they'd watched without lifting a weapon. She thought of the first time she'd threaded that canyon before anyone had a name for the pattern. Now the pattern had a name, and it was hers. She closed the folder, set it on the desk, and began to mentally inventory what she'd need. Not just flight prep, mental terrain, the routes in and out, the possible ambush points, the timing of daylight. She knew from experience that the battle started long before wheels left the ground. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint tang of jet fuel. Somewhere on the apron, Valkyrie 2 waited under her new name, ready for whatever this next ridge would bring. Selena wasn't in a hurry. She'd learned that the surest way to unsettle both allies and enemies was to move at her own pace until the moment came to strike, and then move faster than anyone expected. When the knock came at her door, it was just one of the same plainclothes men from earlier. "We'll brief you at 0500, he said. Selena nodded. She'd be ready, though they still didn't seem to realize she'd been ready long before today. Selena woke before the alarm, the room still sunk in pre-dawn blue. The mission folder lay where she had left it, the grainy image of that distant ridge almost seeming to watch her back. She dressed in silence, the routine precise but unhurried. Flight suit zipped to the collar, gloves rolled and tucked, helmet in its case. Outside, the air carried the bite of early morning. Lights along the taxiway burned low, throwing long shadows across the concrete. She crossed to the hangar where Valkyrie 2 waited, the fresh lettering under the canopy sharp even in the dim glow. A few crew members moved around her, checking fittings and hoses, their conversations clipped and subdued. The plainclothes operative from the day before appeared at her side without a sound. He handed over a small sealed pouch. "Route, comms and contingencies," he said. "You'll be alone out there." "Same as always," she replied. He didn't argue, only added, "Your target area is colder than the hollow, less obvious activity, but it's been flagged 3 times in the last month for unexplained signal patterns." She gave a short nod, then climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The systems came alive under her hands, the displays cycling from black to a mosaic of readouts. Fuel topped, hydraulics in the green, weapons armed. She eased the throttles forward just enough to feel the engines take the weight of the airframe. Ground control cleared her without chatter. As soon as the hangar door rolled high enough, she taxied out, the tires whispering on the tarmac. At the runway threshold, she paused, checking the horizon, a thin line of silver where night and day met. Then she pushed the throttles and felt Valkyrie 2 surge forward, the concrete rushing beneath until the wheels left the earth. The climb was smooth at first, sky opening ahead. She leveled at cruising altitude, letting the autopilot hold steady while she reviewed the mission packet. The coordinates lay beyond any marked corridor, a wedge of terrain that looked unremarkable on paper. But she knew the most dangerous places rarely advertised themselves. As the miles fell away, she dropped lower, trading height for the cover of uneven ground. Outcroppings broke the monotony, their jagged shadows stretching across dry washes. She kept her scan active, looking for anything that suggested human presence. Disturbed soil, geometric lines that didn't belong to nature, sudden bursts of color against the muted earth. 2 ridges ahead, she caught the first anomaly, a faint intermittent pulse on the signal intercept display. Too weak to identify, but rhythmic, like a heartbeat. She adjusted course to approach from the leeward side, keeping the morning sun at her back. The target valley came into view, smaller than Raven's Hollow, but just as unforgiving. Steep walls, narrow throat, limited sky above. Selena brought Valkyrie 2 down to a cautious height, enough to clear obstacles, but low enough to complicate any radar lock. Her eyes roved the ridges, alert for movement. At first, nothing. Then, on the northern slope, she spotted a single figure standing apart from the rock. No weapon raised, no effort to hide, just watching. The sight pulled at something she'd felt before, This wasn't a sniper or a spotter in the usual sense. The stance was too deliberate, too still. She banked slightly, narrowing the angle to get a clearer view. Through the canopy glass, the figure's outline sharpened, tall, unmoving, face obscured by shadow. For several seconds, neither of them shifted. Then, as if on cue, the figure stepped back into the rocks and was gone. Selina keyed her mic on the secure channel. Visual contact with unknown observer. Northern Ridge, grid mark in progress. She tagged the location in her system, transmitting the coordinates back to her handlers. Before any response came, another blip appeared on her HUD. Heat signatures, 3 of them, near the valley's southern mouth. They were moving slowly, as if pacing themselves, and all heading toward the center. She throttled up, cutting across the gap between them and the valley floor. As she closed in, one of the signatures split away, taking a higher path that would give elevation over the center. The pattern was too clean to be chance. She rolled into a shallow dive, putting the reticle on the lead target, and fired a tight burst. The terrain erupted, scattering the trio into cover. Now the valley was awake. The signal intercept spiked, chatter bleeding across multiple bands. Selina pulled back into a climbing turn, scanning for the origin. She caught flashes of movement on both ridges, small teams repositioning, trying to box her in. Her comms crackled. "Reaper, you are weapons free. Contain the area and hold until ground assets arrive." She acknowledged with a double click, already lining up on a pair of fighters crossing open rock. The cannon roared, cutting a jagged path through stone and dust. The survivors fell back, but she could feel the push in their movements. This was about control, not retreat. The next 5 minutes became a series of rapid passes. Each time she cleared one quadrant, new contacts would appear elsewhere, probing, testing. It was less an ambush and more an exercise, like they were measuring her reactions, logging her maneuvers. The thought tightened her grip on the stick. She decided to break the rhythm. Instead of circling back on her last path, she cut hard toward the valley floor, skimming so low that her shadow tangled with the rocks. This drew fire from 2 positions at once, revealing themselves in the process. She banked sharply, brought the nose around, and silenced both with overlapping bursts. Her warning lights flared, countermeasure system on standby. She armed it, knowing the window for a missile launch was still open. Sure enough, moments later a thin plume streaked upward from the southern ridge. She popped flares, jinking hard right, feeling the missile's seeker drift away before it detonated in a harmless blossom of fire. The radio came alive again. "Ground units are 10 minutes out. Keep the airspace locked down." She climbed, widening her view. From above, the valley looked almost calm again, but she knew better. The observers were likely still in place, noting every move. Selina held station, ready to answer any new threat, her mind already cataloguing what this encounter meant. Whatever this was, it wasn't random, and it wasn't over. The figure on the ridge had made sure she understood that. Selina kept Valkyrie 2 in a high, deliberate orbit over the valley, letting the engines hum steady as she studied the terrain below. The southern mouth was quiet now, but her gut told her it was the kind of quiet that shifted with the first opportunity. The figures she had flushed earlier hadn't been trying to win a fight, they had been learning her timing. The comms operator's voice cut through the static. "Reaper, ground elements are 3 minutes out. Confirm area clear for insertion." "Not yet," she answered. "I want another sweep on the west wall before they commit." She dipped the nose, angling toward the section of rock where the first heat signatures had slipped into cover. From altitude, the contours of the ridge looked solid, but as she dropped lower, shallow recesses revealed themselves, pockets big enough to conceal men and gear. She throttled back just enough to sharpen her turn, rolling into a pass that kept her profile low against the slope. There, movement in a narrow cut. One man hauling a cylindrical case, another covering his ascent with a scoped rifle. Selina didn't give them the chance to set up. She squeezed the trigger, letting the cannon tear a path that sent both tumbling into the dust. A second later, a faint shimmer caught her eye on the opposite wall. It was subtle, almost hidden in the heat distortion, but the angle was wrong for sunlight alone. She banked toward it, bringing her wingtip dangerously close to the rock face. The shimmer solidified into the outline of a tarp carefully blended with the stone. Beneath it, two more shapes crouched over equipment that looked nothing like standard weapons. She didn't fire immediately. Instead, she climbed sharply, pulling away as though she hadn't noticed. Only when she had the height to dive did she loop back and come down on them from the blind side. The tarp shredded under the burst, the figures scattering, one disappearing entirely into a fissure, the other sprawling flat to avoid the spray of debris. The secure channel crackled again. "Insertion team on station. Mark LZ." Selena scanned the valley floor. A narrow terrace along the eastern side looked just wide enough for the incoming craft and offered partial concealment from the higher ridges. "Transmit these coordinates," she ordered, punching the location into her system. "They'll have 10 seconds to touch down and unload before they're in the open. Copy. Birds inbound." She kept her speed up, circling in a tightening spiral over the chosen zone. Two dark specks appeared on the horizon, growing quickly into the profiles of low-flying transports. As they closed, she shifted to a protective arc, her flight path designed to cross in front of any potential firing position. The first transport dropped into the terrace, landing gear kicking up dirt. Armed figures spilled out, moving to secure the immediate perimeter. The second bird hovered just long enough to deploy its own load before climbing away to avoid presenting an easy target. Selena widened her circle, scanning the ridge lines. That was when she saw him again, the solitary observer, standing in almost the exact posture as before, this time on the far north wall. The distance was too great for detail, but the stance was unmistakable. She tagged the position and transmitted it to the ground commander. North wall, high shelf, possible command element, no hostile action yet. Logged, came the terse reply. Below, the ground team began advancing in a staggered formation, moving toward the southern exit of the valley. Selena adjusted altitude, ready to suppress any threats ahead of their route. As they approached a choke point, she spotted fresh movement, 3 figures shifting between rocks on the western flank, too close for comfort. She dropped into a steep banking turn, the G-force pressing her into the seat, and unleashed a short burst. The strike shattered the cover they were using, forcing them to scatter downslope, away from the team's path. The convoy pressed forward, momentum unbroken. Halfway to the exit, the valley tried one last trick. A pair of muzzle flashes flared from the shadowed lip above the choke point, timed to pin the ground unit against the wall. Selena reacted instantly, bringing Valkyrie 2 around in a climbing curve that let her fire almost vertically into the overhang. Rock and dust cascaded down, smothering the shooter's line of sight. "Clear," she reported, even as she scanned for follow-on attacks. The ground commander's voice came back calm but clipped. "We're through the gap. Appreciate the cover." With the route open, Selena pulled back into a wider orbit, keeping the retreat corridor under watch until the last of the convoy was out of the valley. The transports returned for pickup, settling quickly to collect the team. She shadowed them as they climbed, her eyes still sweeping the ridges. The observer was gone. The flight back was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that settled the mind. The images of those tarp-covered devices lingered, equipment that didn't belong to any guerrilla fighters she'd ever encountered. It had been positioned too precisely, too deliberately. Whatever data they had been trying to gather, she'd interrupted it, but she doubted she'd stopped the process entirely. By the time they crossed into friendly airspace, she'd already decided to flag the encounter for deeper analysis. It wasn't just about the men with weapons, it was about the pattern that kept repeating, the sense that her missions were being mirrored from the other side. As Valkyrie 2 touched down, the sun was well above the horizon, washing the tarmac in hard light. Selena taxied to the far end of the apron, shut down the engines, and sat for a moment in the cooling cockpit. She knew the debrief would be coming, and with it, more questions about the figure on the ridge. When she finally climbed down, a runner was already waiting with orders. "Ops wants you in the briefing room now." She followed without a word, her boots striking a steady rhythm against the concrete. In her mind, she was already replaying the mission frame by frame, building the sequence of events in case anyone tried to tell her she'd imagined the way those eyes had followed her through the glass. Selena didn't waste a second once the last coded transmission came through. The signal was short, only a string of confirmation pings, but it carried the weight of months of planning. She locked her headset into place, eyes fixed on the tactical display as a swarm of green blips shifted into position. Every element of the strike package was moving according to her last set of coordinates, converging on the kill box she'd marked hours earlier. This was no longer a reconnaissance run, it was the final thrust. Outside, the air was alive with movement. Twin-rotor transports skimmed the ridgeline, their profiles hugging the terrain so tightly that from a distance they could be mistaken for shadows. Ahead of them, gunships fanned out in staggered arcs, engines howling in short, guttural bursts as they climbed, dove, and slid sideways into firing lanes. The valley floor below seemed almost still by comparison, a deceptive calm before the violence about to descend. On the eastern flank, Sergeant Vega led the ground intercept team. He'd been in enough of these operations to recognize the signs, the way the birds slowed their advance for a hot beat before striking, the terse change in radio chatter from descriptive to imperative. "Lock that perimeter," he barked, dropping to one knee to sight through his rifle. Through the scope he could see the target compound, a cluster of stone and corrugated metal structures with crude antennas jutting from their rooftops. A line of vehicles sat half-hidden beneath camouflaged netting, ready for a breakout if they sensed the trap. They wouldn't get the chance. Above, the first of 10 made its run, nose dipped, GAU 8 spinning up with that metallic growl that could be felt as much as heard. Streams of depleted uranium rounds tore into the lead vehicle, ripping through the engine block in a spray of black smoke and twisted steel. The compound erupted into motion, men spilling from doorways, some dragging crates, others hoisting rifles. Vega's team surged forward, moving from cover to cover, their boots kicking up plumes of dust with every lunge. Selena's voice cut through the net, calm but edged with steel. "Alpha and Bravo, pinch east. Charlie, seal the road." No one leaves. It was surgical. The gunships shifted fire to the rear exit points, shredding the escape route while suppressing any return fire from the rooftops. Rockets slammed into the perimeter wall, blowing open entry lanes for the ground units. Vega's lead scout tossed a pair of flashbangs into the breach, the white-hot detonations momentarily drowning the battlefield in light and sound. Through the smoke, the silhouettes of the defenders wavered, disoriented. Vega charged, rifle up, muzzle tracking. One target dropped under a controlled burst. Another threw down his weapon and raised his hands. The rest scattered into the main building, a fatal mistake. From her command perch, Selena could see their retreat on infrared. They're bunching up in the south hall, pushed them into the open courtyard. She keyed a second channel. "Hog 2, give me a wake-up call in Grid Delta 7. The responding pilot didn't hesitate. The Warthog roared in low, releasing a string of 30mm bursts across the courtyard wall. Masonry exploded outward, forcing the defenders into the kill zone, where the ground team was already waiting. It was over in less than 2 minutes, but there was no time to savor the victory. On the northern edge of the map, a lone heat signature was moving fast, slipping away into the rocky defile that led toward the river. Selena's eyes narrowed. This wasn't a panicked escape. It was deliberate, controlled, almost rehearsed. "Vega, you've got a runner. Tag and bag." Vega peeled 2 operators from the main team, cutting through the ruined side gate to intercept. The fugitive was agile, using the terrain for cover, cresting one ridge and dropping behind boulders before sprinting again. Vega adjusted his pace, letting instinct dictate the angle. They caught him halfway down a ravine, cornered between a rock wall and the gun barrels leveled at his chest. Even before the man spoke, Selina recognized the face on Vega's helmet cam feed, the same observer who had appeared in satellite stills weeks ago, always just outside the zone of interest, never holding a weapon yet always present before major enemy movements. His expression was unreadable, part defiance, part weary acceptance. "Secure him," Selina ordered, but she added almost to herself, "and keep him breathing." As the teams consolidated, Intel techs back at the Forward Operations Center were already pulling hard drives from recovered laptops, snapping photos of coded ledgers, tagging crates for transport. Every scrap of material was evidence, but Selina's attention kept drifting back to the prisoner. He was the anomaly, and anomalies were either the key to ending the cycle or the start of something worse. By late afternoon, the compound was cleared. Casualties were lower than expected, a testament to precision execution. The helicopters began their ferry runs, hauling out detainees, supplies and wounded. Selina stood off to one side of the LZ, headset lifted, feeling the rotor wash tug at her flight suit. Vega approached, dust streaking his face, eyes sharp despite the fatigue. "He's not talking," Vega said without preamble. "Didn't even flinch when we cuffed him." "He will," Selina replied, "one way or another." She glanced back toward the horizon where the sun was dipping, painting the jagged peaks in bronze and shadow. Somewhere beyond that skyline, more pieces of the puzzle were waiting. Today had been about more than neutralizing a single target. It was about flushing into the open the network that thought it could stay invisible. As the last bird lifted off, carrying the prisoner under heavy guard, Selina allowed herself a single deep breath. The mission had cost them, every op did, but it had also given them a thread to pull, and she intended to pull until the whole fabric came apart. Hours later, in the secure debrief room, she laid out the sequence on the big screen for the Joint Command staff. Icons slid across the map, representing each fire team's movement, the choke points closed, the escape attempts crushed. When she reached the segment showing the fugitive's capture, she paused. The room fell silent, all eyes on the frozen frame of the man staring up at Vega's camera. "This," Selina said, tapping the image, "is who we've been chasing without knowing it. He's been at every major supply shift in the past 6 months. He knew our approach vector before we committed, and now he's ours." The general at the far end of the table leaned forward. "Do you think he's command?" "I think," Selina answered slowly, "he's the architect. And I think he's just been waiting for us to catch up." The implication hung in the air. If she was right, then today's mission wasn't the endgame. It was the opening move of a much larger confrontation. And somewhere deep down, Selina knew he hadn't run because he was afraid. He'd run because he wanted to be in that room, sitting across from her, forcing the next play. Back in her quarters that night, long after the op center had gone quiet, Selina replayed the helmet cam footage one more time. She watched the man's eyes as Vega stepped into view, saw the faint curve of a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. Not amusement, recognition. She closed the laptop, leaning back in her chair. The storm wasn't over, it had just shifted direction, and now it was coming straight for them. Tomorrow they would start again. They called the operation a success on paper. The reports were crisp, the charts clean, the body counts exact. To anyone looking from the outside, it was a job done, a mission wrapped, a threat erased. But Selina knew better. Victories like this didn't end wars, they shifted them. The prisoner they pulled from the ravine wasn't just another enemy combatant. He was a hinge. One side of that hinge still clung to the past months of shadow moves, ambushes, and near misses. The other side opened into a future neither side could yet see. In the silence of the debrief room after everyone had gone, Selena lingered. The map on the wall glowed faintly, showing the valley where they'd fought, the ridges where the A-10s had carved escape into surrender. The red icons were gone now, replaced with blank terrain, but she could still feel the weight of it. Every shot, every decision, every name. Out on the tarmac, the wind carried the smell of scorched metal and rotor oil. She watched one of the last birds lift off into the dusk, its silhouette shrinking until it was just another shadow among many. Somewhere inside that helicopter, cuffed and silent, the man who had orchestrated so much chaos was already calculating. She could sense it, not through intelligence reports or interrogation notes, but in the way he'd looked at the camera, that tiny curve of the mouth, like someone recognizing a worthy opponent. She'd been in this game long enough to know that enemies who smile in defeat aren't truly beaten. They're simply moving to the next board, and that meant she had to be ready before he made his move. Back in her quarters, she unzipped her pack, pulling out a worn notebook. No digital files this time, too easy to compromise. On the first blank page, she wrote a single word: names. Beneath it, she listed the ones that mattered. The pilots who had flown into fire without hesitation, the ground teams who'd held their lines when the walls blew open, Vega, who had run the ravine without losing sight of his target. And then, at the bottom, she wrote his name, not because she honored him, but because she needed to remember exactly who he was when the time came to finish this. She set the notebook down, leaning back, eyes closed. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was already building the shape of what was coming. It wasn't fear she felt, it was clarity. The kind you only got after walking through fire and finding you could still breathe. Somewhere out there, the man in chains would be thinking the same way, testing the bars, mapping the walls, watching for the crack that would let him slip through. And when he did, because men like him always did, Selena would be waiting, not with more firepower, though there would be plenty of that, not with more troops, though she could call every unit she needed. She'd be waiting with the one thing he couldn't predict, the knowledge that she had already stepped into his game, and she had no intention of losing. The war would not be fought in one valley or one compound. It would spill into cities, into markets, into places where civilians couldn't tell friend from predator. And she would have to walk into those places without the comfort of certainty, knowing only that if she hesitated, someone else would pay the price. She reached for her headset, set it on the desk, and let her hand rest there. Not yet. The next call would come soon enough. Until then, she allowed herself one breath, one still moment, to let the echoes of rotor blades fade into the night. The mission was over. The hunt was just beginning. And in that razor-thin space between victory and the next fight, Selena found the one truth that had carried her through every battlefield, every corridor, every shadow war. You don't survive by winning. You survive by refusing to quit. She wasn't going anywhere. Neither was he.